Hello, Magic players and collectors. Welcome back to the Land Library. I'm your librarian, and in this episode of Legacy Logbook, I'll be covering land subtypes and, of course, the lands that have them. So, despite the fact that there are lands with subtypes as early as Alpha, the timeline doesn't actually start there. The basics and true duels do currently have subtypes, but they didn't always, and they definitely didn't when they were first printed. The mechanic of subtypes itself wasn't introduced all the way up until 8th edition in 2003, 10 whole years after the start of the game, which means that a lot of subtypes were introduced in 8th edition and retroactively given to anything printed earlier, which is something I wish they'd do with some newer subtypes as well, but I digress. Starting with the basic subtypes, these were added to, of course, the basics, along with the snow-covered basics from Ice Age, and side note, the basic supertype was also added to the basics to differentiate them from other lands with those subtypes, which are forest, mountain, swamp, island, and plains. These subtypes were also added to the true duels, but not the basic supertype for the previously mentioned differentiation, which simplified their previous rules text that they counted as the names of the basics and were affected by spells that targeted them to simply a couple of words in the type line. And speaking of simplifying rules text, the basic subtypes are the only land subtypes that have built-in mechanics instead of just being an identifier, and the built-in mechanics is that they can tap for their corresponding color regardless of any other abilities or changes to a card. So something that is currently a forest can always tap for a green mana. Mountains are red, swamps are black, islands are blue, and plains are white. But the basic types aren't the only subtypes in 8th edition. It also added the desert subtype to Desert from Arabian Nights. Yet didn't actually reprint it with said subtype. Desert wasn't reprinted with a subtype until Time Spiral time shifted in 2006, and remained the only subtype desert for another decade after that. I totally understand making Desert a desert, but I'm not sure why they added it in 8th edition to one card with seemingly no intention to add any more, or even update the print in that set. Like, why didn't they just add it in Time Spiral time shifted when they reprinted the card? But, I'm getting a little off track. It's not the only questionable subtype decision in 8th edition either, because it also introduced the layer subtype. And to be fair, the layers kind of introduced the concept of land subtypes to begin with, but put it in the rules text instead of the type line. But just like Desert, they didn't actually reprint them with the subtype in this set, and the wait was even longer for the layers, only ever getting the updated reprints in Dominaria Remastered, which released in 2023, a whole 20 years after 8th edition. And since no other lands to this date, at least not legal ones, have been printed with the layer subtype, it basically only existed on the list of subtypes in the rules for 20 years. The layers are Cross's Catacombs, Daragaz's Caldera, Dromar's Cavern, Rith's Grove, and Treva's Ruins. And finally, we get to a non-basic subtype that 8th edition added and actually printed on cards, the Urza subtype. And the other Urza subtypes, Tower on Urza's Tower, Mine on Urza's Mine, and Power Plant on Urza's Power Plant. We'll see the Urza subtype used multiple times later, but say goodbye to Tower, Mine, and Power Plant because those subtypes never get used again. Finally, moving on from 8th edition, the following set Mirrodin introduced the subtype Locust on Cloudpost. This is a pretty rarely used subtype because Locust lands, especially Cloudpost, can combo off of each other to a crazy degree, and while not an inherent ability of the subtype, Locust lands tend to care about the number of Locust lands, and it can scale pretty high. But since this was the only one, it couldn't do anything too crazy when it was first introduced. It took a few years for the next lands with subtypes to be printed. In Ravnica City of Guilds, this set added the Shock lands, or, well, 4 of them, with the other 6 being printed in the rest of the block. These were dual-color lands with basic subtypes that enter tapped unless you pay 2 life, essentially meant to be a more balanced replacement for the True Duels, and these still get reprints while True Duels kinda do not. After skipping a set, the next one is Urza's Factory in Time Spiral, which, as you could probably guess, has the Urza subtype, although it doesn't really do anything to interact with that subtype besides just having it, so there's not a whole lot to say about this one. Then we get something really unique in Future Sight, Dryad Arbor. This is a creature and a land at the same time with the Forest subtype. It's the only card like this, so it has many unique traits, such as being the only land with a color, the only land with summoning sickness, and a creature that isn't a spell and doesn't use the stack. And while not unique for long, it's also the first instance of a non-basic land with a single basic type. A few sets later, Morningtide adds the second instance with Murmuring Bosk, which also has subtype Forest, and the following set, Shadowmoor, adds another, but in all 5 basic subtypes: Sapseep Forest, Mad Blind Mountain, Leech-Ridden Swamp, Moonring Island, and Mistvale Plains. Following these is a 2-year gap of nothing, until Scars of Mirrodin adds a second Locust land, Glimmerpost, greatly boosting the power of Locust lands. Then we hit another 2-year gap before we get something new again, but it's a new subtype entirely. Return to Ravnica introduced gates with the Guild Gates. Return to Ravnica added 5 of them, and the next set in the block, Gatecrash, added the other 5. Gate is still just an identifier subtype, but it does have a lot more interaction and support than most other land subtypes, including a win condition card, Maze's End, which I myself have a deck based around. This pattern continues with another 2-year gap up to Battle for Zendikar, which introduced the Battle Lands. This is another cycle of dual colors with basic subtypes, this time just allied colors, and the other colors will come later, but like much later. Then, you guessed it, 2 more years and we get the Bicycle Lands in Amonkhet, another allied colored cycle of dual colors with basic subtypes. However, it also added several deserts: Cradle of the Accursed, Grasping Dunes, Painted Bluffs, Sun-Scorched Desert. Then the following set in the block, Hour of Devastation, added even more deserts: Desert of the Indomitable, Desert of the Fervent, Desert of the Glorified, Desert of the Mindful, Desert of the True, Dunes of the Dead, Endless Sands, Hostile Desert, Scavenger Grounds, Survivor's Encampment, Hashtep Oasis, Ramanap Ruins, Infear Deadlands, Ipnu Rivulet, and Sheffit Dunes. Ooh, that's a lot of deserts. Then, skipping a few sets ahead, Guilds of Ravnica adds a new gate, Gateway Plaza, and while not a land, it also adds some pretty decent support for gates, making them even easier to interact with, and boosting the power of the subtype. Skipping ahead about a year, Throne of Eldraine adds new monocolored, non-basic lands with basic subtypes: Gingerbread Cabin with Forest, Dwarven Mine with Mountain, Witch's Cottage with Swamp, Mystic Sanctuary with Island, and Idyllic Grange with Plains. Then, skipping just one set, Ikoria Lair of Behemoth adds the Triomes, a set of tricolors with basic subtypes in wedge colors. These are pretty cool, and the first instance of lands with more than 2 basic subtypes. But then we're back to 2, with Kaldheim's Snow Duels. All 10 dual colors with basic subtypes, but also the Snow supertype, which adds some really nice options to Snow decks. But we're not talking about super types, we're talking about subtypes, so moving on, the next one is Urza Saga out of Modern Horizons 2, which is a very odd land. It's an enchantment and a land with a subtype for each, with Urzas and Saga. And it acts like a Saga, but uses a land drop and interacts with other land-based abilities like Landfall or Earthbending, but it really doesn't function like a land would, because it gets its playable mechanics from being a Saga. Skipping forward a couple sets, we get the shard-colored Triomes in the Streets of New Capenna. I feel like it's not a lot to say there. Then the following set, Battle for Baldur's Gate, adds 9 new gates, including gate supporting gates, which really boosts the subtype. And they all have gate in the name, and I've already said gate too many times, so I don't really want to name them all, but feel free to pause and read them if you want. Next up is the Typal Tap lands from Dominaria United, which is another cycle of dual colors with basic subtypes. But the set also adds Thran Portal, another gate, which also picks up a basic type, but doesn't have one printed. Then we get Urza's Workshop in the Brothers War Commander, which is of course a new Urza's subtype, and is actual support for the subtype. It interacts with the subtype. Immediately following that is Phyrexia All Will Be One with a new subtype Sphere. There are 9 total, and they don't really have much going on. There's one single support card, which also supports Locust, and the lands with the subtype don't really interact with the subtype or other lands with the subtype. Honestly, it's probably the weakest subtype other than maybe Layers. Then the Lord of the Rings set drops a new gate, the Black Gate. Although it doesn't really do much to interact with the subtype, it's kind of just there for flavor. Nor is there support for gates in this set. Then we get another new subtype in the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, Cave, which comes in with 18 lands and some decent support around it, as well as self-interaction with the subtype. Easily one of the strongest land subtypes right off the bat. The following set, Murders at Karlov Manor, adds the Surveil lands, another cycle of dual colors with basic subtypes. Not a whole lot to say about things with basic subtypes anymore. And the following set after that, Outlaws of Thunder Junction, drops another batch of deserts and desert support. Full cycle of all 10 dual colors with desert and 6 more solo deserts. Now, for a set that drops new lands in multiple non-basic subtypes, which hasn't happened since the original introductions in 8th edition, Modern Horizons 3 and its commander set add Lazotep Pori, which is a desert, Sunken Palace, which is a cave, Urza's Cave, which is Urza's and Cave, Talon Gates of Madara, which is a gate, Trench Post, which is a locust, and Planar Nexus, which is all non-basic subtypes, even future ones. And speaking of all types, the next set, Duskmourn, adds Everywhere, a token land with all 5 basic subtypes. Then we skip a few sets up to Final Fantasy, which introduced the subtype Town, with 23 lands. This is the largest addition to a subtype in a single set, and is more than most subtypes have in total. And with some pretty fun support cards, but not really a lot of them. The next set adds a new subtype as well, Planet in Edge of Eternities. The planets include Adagia, Windswept Bastion, Evendo, Waking Haven, Cavaron, Memorial World, Susur Secundi, Void Altar, and Uthros Titanic God Core. All of these planets do come with the ability to station, which puts charge counters on them, but it's technically not a property of the subtype, just something tied to the subtype, so other planets like Planar Nexus can't actually station, but are still a valid target for support cards like Drill 2 Deep to get charge counters on them. And over in the Commander set, we also get new Bicycle and Battle lands, Festering Thicket, Glittering Massif, Vernal Fen, and Radiant Summit. The next land is another land like Thran Portal that has no printed basic land types, but picks one up when it enters the battlefield, Multiversal Passage from Spider-Man. But unlike Thran Portal, it doesn't have any printed subtypes at all, so it can't really be interacted with much in zones outside of the battlefield. Then in Avatar The Last Airbender set, we get a new cave, Secret Tunnel. But other than just adding a card, the set doesn't really have any support for the subtype. Finally, all that's left are Rain-Slicked Cops and Sodden Verdure in Lorwyn Eclipsed Commander, which are another bicycle and battle land respectively. However, even though that's the last printed set, the soon-to-release Secrets of Strixhaven will finish off the enemy-colored bicycle and battle lands, with Coastal Peak, Umbral Expanse, Scorched Geyser, and Eclipsed Steppe, along with a new cycle of enemy-colored duels with basic subtypes, the Turbulent lands. And that's it for the timeline, at least for now, but I can't see the future to know what's coming after Secrets of Strixhaven, so on to the trivia. Urza's Tower, Urza's Mine, and Urza's Power Plant all originally checked for the names of the other cards in the trio, but when subtypes were added, they started checking for each other's subtypes instead. And Urza's is its own type, so despite still naming both of the others and thus repeating Urza's twice, the Urza's subtype requirement will already be fulfilled by the initial card that's doing the checking to begin with. This is also why tower, mine, and power plant were not given to any other lands like Phyrexian Tower or Strip Mine, because then the trio wouldn't actually need each other anymore. You could just use any tower, mine, or power plant with the one Urza's thing to power it up. There are no ways to give lands flash, but there are ways to give creatures flash, so Dryad Arbor has special rules for if it were to gain flash from its creature side. And the source does have to say creature instead of spell, because Dryad Arbor does not count as a spell. It still uses a land drop, so cannot be played outside of your turn or when you don't have a land drop, but it wouldn't be restricted to main phase anymore. So you can play it on upkeep, on combat, on end phase, whenever you want, as long as it's still your turn with an open land drop. And there's also one card that can potentially give Urza's Saga flash, so it follows the same timing rules, but you're way more likely to see Dryad Arbor get flash than Urza's Saga. Now, there are a number of non-legal cards with subtypes that don't really belong on the main timeline, but do at least deserve a mention. The Secret Layer with Subtype Layer is a special Heroes of the Realm promo. These are promos given out to Wizards of the Coast staff. These promos have a non-standard back and aren't legal in any format. However, are technically legal in Commander if your name is the name printed on the card, so, specific staff members can play them. That's the point of giving them to staff. Or I suppose, if you had coincidentally someone with the same name as one of those printed staff members somehow get their hands on one, they could also play it in Commander. There are several playtest cards from mystery booster sets or event promos that have subtypes. Jesconian Isle with Island, Gobland with Mountain, Fetching Garden with Forest and Plains, the Belligerent and Useless Island with Island, Value Town with Town, A Town with Town, Second City with Town, Reflective Gate with Gate, The Forgotten Place with Locust and Sphere, Urza's Hot Dog Stand with Urza's, and Processing Plant with Power Plant. And there are some subtypes on playtest cards that are not officially recognized. Like, they aren't in the rules, so not only is the card not legal, but the subtype itself isn't either. These are Processing Plant again with Ulamogs, Omen Path to Naya with Omen Path, Blustering Barnyard with Barnyard, and Barry's Land with the basic subtype Cloud. Also should mention, Value Town and Second City both came out before the subtype was officially added, so they were in this group, but aren't in this group anymore. Then there are a couple of uncards with subtypes, Urza's Funhouse with the Urza subtype, and Nearby Planet, which has a special ability called Rangeling, which gives it all land subtypes, but doesn't have any, printed subtypes in its line. And that about wraps up everything on land subtypes. If you've made it this far in the video, please drop a like for turn, and subscribe for more Landfield content. If I missed anything, got anything wrong, or you just have questions, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next Legacy Logbook, which will be updates and corrections to the previous videos.